So now, let me invite our next keynote speaker, Professor De Haas, to share his views on the increasingly complex migration issue and his aspiration capability model. So, Professor De Haas, please, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you in Japan right now, but I really hope this still gives the opportunity to share some of the insights of the research I've been conducting over the last 3 decades or so, and in particular to talk about, I was particularly asked to talk about the aspiration capabilities model and what it could sort of teach us in rethinking migration. And this is really a model that, I would say a different paradigm I've tried to develop about migration, because doing my own research, particularly in Morocco, where I've done most of my field work, and other countries in Africa, I realized increasingly that the so-called, that classic migration theories, and particularly the push-pull model, really don't help us much to understand migration, both particularly if we think about the causes of migration, but even the patterns of migration we will see. And I've argued in my publications that the model is not only simplistic, but actually quite misleading, and leads us to wrong conclusions about, for instance, how development will affect migration. And indeed, migration is much more complex. And I do think it is very important that we develop a more realistic paradigm on migration, because eventually it will also help us to develop policies that are more realistic. Because we cannot deny the fact that, although I think it is an exaggeration to say that all migration policies failed, in fact, most migration policies work quite well. We are also very much influenced by images we see of boats and people dying on borders, and these are real issues, but we have to see things into perspective. The vast majority of migrants in the world still moves legally, and that shows that quite a lot of the rules and regulations we have about migration actually do work. But on the other hand, we cannot deny that if we look at some aspects of migration, and I particularly think about lower skilled labor migration and asylum seekers, we clearly see that the EU, the US, many countries in the world have been trying to regulate that, but actually haven't been very successful, particularly if you look at the longer term. And I think here it is really important to understand why the so-called solutions that policymakers have put forward don't always work, and in some cases actually have turned out to be completely counterproductive. So that is really why we need to rethink migration. Now, what is this aspiration capabilities model about? It is, first of all, a different paradigm of thinking about migration. And, many of my colleagues and many of my mentors, I mentioned names like Douglas Massey, Stephen Castles, Ronald Skeldon, have already argued very convincingly that the push-pull model doesn't help us much further, and that we need a more sophisticated vision on migration. What I try to do in my own work is try to bring some of that work together and develop a sort of new idea, if you'd like, paradigm, to think about these things. So what does it mean? First of all, it means that we redefine human mobility. If we really want to understand the relation between migration and broader processes of development, we have to see human mobility not so much as the act of moving, but as people's freedom to decide where to live, including the option to stay at home. So mobility then is something different than just migrating. It is a fundamental human freedom. And here I borrow on Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, who defines development as the ability of people to live the lives they have reason to value. And so you could also distinguish mobility freedoms as one of those fundamental human freedoms. If you take that freedom away from people, and I think some of that, almost the COVID crisis, lockdowns were almost an experiment. if you take away that fundamental freedom, and I'm not even talking about migration, but just geographical mobility freedoms, people generally feel deprived. They may agree or disagree with it, but it's felt like a form of deprivation. And it is very clear if you do research in countries that don't have many mobility freedoms. In my case, it was a lot in Morocco and other African countries, that lack of mobility freedom is really felt as a form of deprivation. This is nothing to do with the sort of moral or ethical valuation of it. It's just how it impacts people's mindsets. So, and then the second thing is that I try to propose migration as a function of people's aspirations and capabilities to move. And this is also going back to really questioning this fundamental core assumption that we see in a lot of policy, but also academic narratives, particularly when it is about so-called South-North migration, that migration somehow is this desperate flight from misery, that problems like poverty, inequality, climate change even are the so-called root cause of South-North migration. Now, of course, suffering on the border does happen, and some migrants are clearly desperate. But on the other hand, we do know from a lot of research that for most migrants, migration is an investment in a better future. And migration comes with a lot of resources you need actually to make it possible to migrate. I'm talking about financial resources, but I'm also talking about education, for instance, cultural capital, which will help you in terms of getting visas or residence permits. And of course, social networks will help people to migrate. So you need resources to migrate. And that explains the paradox that the poorest of the poorest migrate less than the slightly wealthier of. And just look around the world, what are the most important source countries of labor migrants over the last half a century or so? We think about countries like Mexico, Turkey, or the Philippines. These are typically not low-income countries, and that is not a coincidence. But the second aspect is about aspirations, and I think that is equally important as the idea that you need a certain threshold of wealth in order to be able to migrate. I can give the example of education. I mean, nobody would contest that more education is good for development. But what we've typically seen in surveys, analysis, is that as soon as people get access to education, primary, secondary, their whole life perspective changes. For instance, if you build schools in rural areas, irrespective of economic conditions, people generally no longer want to be a farmer and generally imagine their futures in the city and different kind of jobs. And this is why we've seen in survey research that increasing education means actually more migration. And this explains this paradox of the migration transition, first hypothesized by Wilbur Zelinsky, an American geographer, and further developed by Ronald Skeldon. And I've tried in my own work to elaborate further on these ideas, that if poor countries become richer, migration starts to increase, not to decrease. And it is only after a certain threshold level that emigration starts to decrease, from which point countries tend to transform from out-migration countries to net immigration countries. Now, those transitions have happened in the past to many countries. An example in the East Asian region is South Korea, obviously, but also Southern Europe is a very good example. Countries like Spain and Italy were, of course, quintessential emigration countries, but have become destinations. Ireland is another good example, but I could give many more. But there seem to be new countries appearing on the horizon, the new destination countries. Turkey is a very good example, but also Mexico seems to be developing into a destination country. And a country like Morocco as well sees increasing immigration. At the same time, still many Moroccans leave. So it shows the sort of non-linearity between levels of development and levels of migration. So the discourses we hear often of politicians, for instance, the previous Biden administration ran this root causes narrative that said, well, the only way we can stop migration, unwanted migration, is to develop poor countries. Well, the evidence suggests strongly that any form of development, whether you think about poverty reduction, infrastructure improvement, or better education, will more likely lead to more instead of less migration. I will get back to that when I'll talk about future scenarios and what we could think about the future of migration. What does that mean? So this is in a nutshell what the aspiration capabilities approach tries to convey. And I'm not going to be overly modest here. I really think we need a paradigm change. The push-pull model will not help us to understand these things. It portrays migration as a one-off move from poor to rich countries. We, of course, know that migration is much more a circulatory process where people go back and forth. And we really need to understand how, for instance, policies impinge on the overall process of coming and going if we really want to develop a scientific understanding of how policies may affect migration, often also in unexpected and unintended ways. What can we think? How can we use this model to think or rethink the way we think about impacts of migration? Well, this was the topic of most of my research in the past, was the whole relation between migration and development. Now, what I actually did in the first 10 minutes of my talk is give a very brief sketch about how development affects migration. And there you can say, well, development, certainly in the early phases, generally leads to more mobility. I'm not only talking about international mobility, but particularly about internal mobility, because I think perhaps that's the best example to illustrate how migration is part of development. And that is really the key insight, I think, to take home. And I'm here quoting famous migration scholar Ronald Skeldon. He ended his book, Migration and Development, with one very simple phrase, which was, migration is development. So that is really the revolutionary sort of insight that Zelensky and Skeldon already brought to the field, that migration is not so much something you can fix with development. Paradoxically, certainly when countries move from, let's say, low to middle income country and go through fundamental transitions, mobility tends to increase. And I think urbanization is the best example. So all societies in the world are urbanizing very fast in the developing world. And it is very difficult to imagine this urbanization without rural to urban migration, and the other way around. It's very difficult to conceptualize even the modern experience of migration without urbanization. And this is not about liking or not liking migration. It's really about understanding how it is a fundamental part of the process. And that also explains why so many attempts by governments to stop or curb rural to urban migration in many developing countries have basically never really worked. Of course, you could mitigate things. You could stimulate development of mid-sized towns and cities in rural areas. But the point is, you cannot stop the overall process of urban growth and concentration of population and economic activities in urban areas. And to a certain extent, I think this is an important insight to take on board when we think about migration. Of course, this whole perspective does not address some other very, really important issues, which I think are very important issues to address if we want to understand, and I'll come back to that in the end of my talk, why policymakers in Western countries, or wealthy countries, struggle so much with immigration. That is because in the debate, there is this almost elephant in the room in terms of the real driver of a lot of migration in the world is obviously the demand for low-skilled labor. Although the paradigm has really shifted on high-skilled labor. I mean, there is this narrative about the global race for talent and countries that try to attract engineers and doctors and scientists. We all know that there is an increasing shortage of lower-skilled workers. And of course, ever since the day of the guest workers and the bracero workers in Europe and in the United States, the demand for low-skilled labor has been a very important driver of migration. So if we don't address those issues, we are going to go nowhere. And I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. Now, so what can we, first of all, the effect or the relation between development and migration is fundamentally complex, obviously, but it is also non-linear. It means that in early phases of development, there's a lot of evidence out there that it actually boosts migration, both within and outside countries. So how could we then conceptualize the impacts of migration? Now, if we think about how migration affects development in origin countries, up to, I think, roughly 2000, 2005, the debate was very much dominated by the so-called brain drain paradigm. And I think we're all aware with the brain drain paradigm, it was a very pessimistic paradigm, which considered the emigration as a basic loss for origin countries. And there have been a lot of debates about whether rich countries that attract those migrants should compensate poor countries for the education they offered to those migrants. And this debate has gone nowhere because this is very difficult to organize and enforce. Also, attempts to stop higher skilled people from leaving have generally entirely failed. So this is very difficult to imagine to be possible to be successful. So we have tried to develop different ways of thinking about this, particularly rethinking the whole way migration affects development in origin countries. Here it is really very important to think about migration not so much as a sort of one-off move between origin and destination, but rather as a circulatory process. And here I think is the issue. We know from a lot of research that migrants leave their countries in order to try to get access, of course, to higher incomes, to better education, and of course, experiences abroad. Now, a lot of migrants initially leave with the idea of either returning to the origin country once they have gotten an education, accumulated certain experiences, and subsequently can go back to the origin country. I think where it often goes wrong is that circulation gets interrupted. And I think here comes in the policy of the destination country. We just know that the more difficult you make it for migrants to come, the higher the tendency is to stay. And this is why in the past we've seen this experience with the guest workers, for instance, that I think well-intended but ill-conceived attempts to stop that migration actually stimulated the permanent settlement of those migrant populations, after which they entered a process of family reunification, and migrants basically stayed and did not return. Now, does that mean that migration is then a net loss for the origin country? Well, not necessarily. Migrants send back a lot of money. We don't know the exact figures because the official figures don't measure what the money migrants and the goods migrants take in cash or sent through informal channels, but remittances are at least 3 times the volume of total development aid. And we know that aid is not really aid. These are basically often loans, and a lot of this money is flowing back to the donor countries. This, you could say, is money that really flows directly from the migrant to the families back home. So some people have branded this as a sort of form of bottom-up development aid. I think this is a naive view, because exactly based on the aspiration capabilities model, and this is also what a lot of research shows, that migrants are generally not from the poorest countries and not from the poorest sections of origin countries. So I think we have to be careful not to be overly optimistic about the poverty reduction function of migration, but still it cannot be denied that migrant remittances and other contributions of migrants back home have a hugely positive impact on the livelihoods of the families and the communities they come from. That is very difficult to deny. And in many cases, in most cases, it explains why migrants still come, even if they end up in quite difficult situations of being exploited, having no documents. Migrants are in for the long haul in general. And I'm coming back to this initial insight that migration, rather than a desperate flight from misery, for most, it's not a representative vision. Most migrants see migration as an investment. And this is not an investment by individuals, but this is an investment by families and entire communities. And migrants also expect, in a way, to pay back. And many migrants try to come back or invest in origin communities. Okay, so we have to, I think, revise a bit this overly pessimistic view. But on the other hand, I think it is also dangerous to then think that migration can be a fix for problems in destination countries. Clearly, it can't. So although migration has often very positive impacts, if you look at the micro level of the family and communities, it would be a complete illusion that migrants and remittances can overcome structural development obstacles. And like, for instance, failing government, corruption, but also international issues like trade barriers and all sorts of other things that hinder development. So it would be quite naive to think that migrants can overcome this. And to a certain extent, you could say that migration is also convenient for authoritarian leaders, for instance, because it can, as long as people don't go in the street and protest because of a lack of meaningful employment opportunities, for instance, it can be convenient to send people abroad. And this has actually been the policy of many governments. The previous Marcos government, so I'm going back to the 1970s, in the Philippines, you really used migration as a safety valve to lower discontent in the Philippines. So it can really also be a safety valve to avoid a lot of reform. Again, it doesn't mean migration is, if people wouldn't have migrated, reform would have happened. I think these are also dangerous reasonings, but I think we need a more nuanced view. And clearly what we see, I think one thing to say is that and this is more specifically about high-skilled migration, let's not automatically call high-skilled migration brain drain. And my colleague Michael Clemens, who's read a lot about this, I think he was absolutely right when he said, let's just talk about high-skilled emigration. Not all high-skilled emigration turns out to be a brain drain. Brain drain is like jumping to conclusions. It's already putting a judgment in the way you characterize a whole group of people. And I think that is damaging. So let's please call this high-skilled emigration from developing countries. I think we have to be precise. Now, of course, in some cases, it can be a drain in the sense of people not coming back, never contributing to their origin countries. But I think it is also very important to not blame migrants for the problems that made them leave in the first place. We know, for instance, about medical migration from Africa, that medical emigration from African countries is not the cause of the healthcare crisis in many African countries. Actually, the healthcare crisis was the reason why many people left, because, for instance, they couldn't find meaningful jobs. And I think quite some governments in sub-Saharan Africa, I think Ghana is a very good example, have actually changed their policies in order to retain more medical personnel, and have been quite successful to do so. So let's not blame migration for all the problems that origin countries could witness. I would almost try to say the same about destination countries, because when we hear political discourse in Europe and in America, it almost seems that migration is the mother of all problems. And I'll get back to that briefly. Of course, migration can create problems, and it is not only a good news story. We have to be nuanced about these things. So yes, migration cannot be blamed for structural development problems. We cannot blame the so-called brain drain for structural problems in higher skilled sectors in developing countries. We can, of course, think about what could we do in order to enhance the development benefits of migration, or call it the development potential of migration. And I think in a way it's quite clear cut. Also here, if you try to prevent this migration, the result tends to be backfiring. I always give the following example. The Moroccan government for many years, if a civil servant would move to the West, they would exclude that person from lifetime from civil service as a kind of punishment. Well, it didn't really stop people from leaving. It prevented them from returning, obviously. This is what we often see, that misguided attempts to try to stop things often backfire if you talk about migrants. What you can do, of course, is make things more attractive for migrants. And that is what many origin countries have tried to do. But I think in the case of destination countries, facilitate circulation, I would say. Really think about your policies. If you really want migrants to contribute to development in origin countries, make sure they have rights. If they live on the margin of society, have very low income, they will have very low capabilities. So I'm coming back to these capabilities. They may have aspirations to send money back and invest back home or return, but they simply lack the capabilities. Undocumented migrants cannot circulate, of course, because they will stay put. We know that overstaying is a huge issue. I'm already slipping a bit into policies, and Japan is a huge issue, for instance. I mean, countries with very restrictive immigration policies that don't address the real root causes of migration, and labor demand is one of them, end up with a lot of people overstaying their visas. But these migrants are also not the type of migrants that go back easily to their origin countries. So if you stop circulation, of course, it's going to be harmful for development in origin countries. Now, if you facilitate circulation, I think migration within countries, so internal migration is the best example. Of course, in that case, you will also enhance the development potential of migration. Am I still with you? Can you just confirm that?
Of course, yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted the confirmation. Okay, thank you. So there is no automatic predetermined impact of migration on development in origin countries. I think we have to talk about migration has a development potential. It increases the capabilities of migrants to contribute to development, to enhancement of things in origin countries, of course, starting with their families, investing in housing, investing in education, investing in healthcare, small enterprises. We should never dismiss those contributions. A lot of my research has exactly been about this. I can give you an example. Often migrants have been criticized for building houses in their origin countries, but we also know from research that can actually create a lot of employment in those areas for non-migrants. So there is some trickle down happening in those regions. Can migration solve my development problems? No, obviously it can't. So I think we really have to temper expectations here. So migration cannot be a fix for development problems. So I think that is very important. Now, of course, I was also asked to talk about what migration means for destination countries. Well, this is a huge debate. The book I published 2 years ago, How Migration Really Works, tries to summarize some of that evidence. But I think what we can confidently say is that the so-called pro and anti-migration camps tend to hugely exaggerate the positive or negative impacts of migration on, for instance, the economy. What we, for instance, know about research on the economic impacts of immigration is that by far the biggest effect of immigration is to increase the overall size of the economy. So the whole economic pie simply becomes bigger because migrants are not only workers, they're also consumers. But if we look at the average impact on income, for instance, we see that the effects are incredibly small. So the pie becomes bigger. The average size of every slice stays roughly equal. So I think this again should temper a sort of exaggeration almost of what we can expect migration to contribute. Once we start, and this is just about average impacts, of course, once we start to focus on who benefits most from migration economically, then I think a clear pattern of differentiation starts to appear, which also makes it understandable why lower skilled workers generally are less positive about immigration than the well-off. It is quite clear-cut from econometric studies that try to look at the impact of migration on incomes. That is, the already higher incomes reap the most benefits from immigration. And I think this is very easy to understand. Of course, businesses are the prime beneficiaries of the influx of labor, both higher and lower skilled, because it increased their productivity, increased their profits, and of course, increased the income of shareholders of those companies. But migrants are just more, migrants, of course, also contribute to middle-class households, but delivering all sorts of services. So here I'm coming back to the key importance in contemporary neoliberal economies with their gig, sort of flexible labor markets of migrant workers. Just think about the whole food sector. Who is harvesting food? Who is processing food? Who is cooking food? Who's washing the dishes in restaurants? Who's delivering the food? Everybody knows the answer in big cities or Western countries. These are predominantly migrant workers. Of course, many other sectors. I just have to think about personal care, cleaning. I already mentioned agriculture, construction. There are a whole range of sectors which have become increasingly dependent on the influx of migrant labor. Now, many middle-class households benefit obviously from the services. I forgot to mention, of course, migrants being active in domestic work at home, cleaning and things like that. So income households benefit a lot from those services that migrants deliver. The only group that is really not benefiting economically, most studies seem to suggest, is the lowest income earners. Let's say the lowest 10 to 20% of income earners don't benefit from immigration economically. But these are exact the same groups that see the day-to-day consequences of immigration in terms of how their neighborhoods change, how their workplaces change, how they may suddenly be surrounded by people who don't speak the language anymore. So the real impacts of migration in terms of daily lives are felt exactly by those populations that don't see the day-to-day, the economic benefits of immigration. Of course, that doesn't mean that immigrants are responsible for all the problems they are blamed for these days in contemporary Western societies. But of course, it makes it very attractive for populist far-right politicians to exactly suggest that. But I think the pro-migration camp has been blind for the fact that the benefits of immigration are not equally distributed across populations of destination countries. And I think this should really give reason to rethink the way we operate our economies. And to me, it shows a huge paradox. And this is something that many migration scholars, including Stephen Castles, have observed before. There is a fundamental discrepancy between two mega trends in the Western world. The first is the broad tendency towards neoliberalization. We've seen that ever since the late 1980s, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. This was accelerated after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I'm talking about a smaller role of the state in the economy, laissez-faire economic policies, but in particular, when we talk about migration, the retreat of the state from regulating labor. And here I think we see the hypocrisy in the political sphere. Everybody talks about, lots of politicians we can hear about, we have to fight illegal migration. And I've been hearing that for the last 30 years already. I've come to the conclusion that this is, let me be honest and frank, this is hypocrisy. Because as long as Western societies tolerate that migrant workers are being exploited, and as long as we don't punish and control employers, but only migrants, you can never solve this problem. And many people have already said it. I mean, this is really up for political debate. I'm not a politician. You can basically do two things. Either you regulate labor, you create legal channels, or you reform your economic system so you take away demand for that kind of labor. But as long as we tolerate this happening, people will keep on coming. And I've seen this in my recent research in Senegal. People just know that there are jobs in Spain. And the moment you land in Spain, you're going to be tolerated because employers are looking for your labor. And this has been going on for the last 30 to 35 years. This is why, and I think the whole discussion in Europe, I could only hear the last bit of Professor Joppke's presentation, but I think, yes, we need a debate on asylum, but I think the debate is too limited. We need a debate on labor, because we know that apart from refugees, many people cross borders to seek and find work. I think what's happening in the United States is very, very telling. Who is getting punished? Migrants. Are employers being punished? I don't think so. And I think this is exactly showing the hypocrisy. And what these policies do is not very unrealistic to think that the Trump administration is going to deport 11 or 12 million undocumented migrants. It's going to make migrants even more fearful to reclaim rights when they're being exploited. It's going to make their lives more miserable. It's not going to solve the overall problem. So I think states really have to stop denying that reality, and we need a real debate about migration, which is really about the role of labor. And if states want to regulate migration better, they should be willing to regulate their labor markets better. Well, where that debate needs to be going, that is not my task. I'm not a politician, but I think a real debate about migration is a debate about the kind of society we would like to live in. And this is also sort of where I conclude my book with this idea. So what can we say based on this framework about future trends in mobility? Well, I think I don't have a crystal ball, so it's impossible to know what's going to happen. But I think there are some things that seem to be pretty evident. Everything I'm going to say right now is based on the presumption that rich areas in the world. So I'm talking about East Asia, I'm talking about European Union, I'm talking about North America, the Gulf region. These are really the main sort of migration magnets in the world. Will stay wealthy and democratic and thriving. Of course, I cannot know this. If current developments in the US will continue, you may well see a reverse so-called brain drain from the United States to Europe. And this would be quite ironic because we know that that in the days of Nazi Germany, we had this, and up to the 1960s, we had this whole reverse movement of high-skilled people from Europe to America. So these things are very difficult to predict. But particularly if you think about labor, and as we all know, that population aging will not mean that the demand of migrant labor will stop. I think the biggest thinking error migration specialists made back in the 1970s, that they thought that the era of low-skilled labor migration was over. We know this is not true. Still, most migrants are low-skilled workers. They may actually have higher educations doing lower-skilled jobs, but because of the increasing education of the domestic workforce, combined with aging, the number of people who are willing to do all sorts of kind of service jobs, because it's no longer so much about industrial and mining jobs like back in the 1960s and 70s, we see this huge increase of migrant workers migration for these kind of lower skilled jobs. So this has been something that will continue in the future. So I'm assuming that this demand for low-skilled migration, lower-skilled migrants will not stop. But here it becomes interesting. If we take on board migration transition theory and the examples I was already giving, and just focusing on Europe here, we could say that the group of countries that attracts labor is increasing. So if we would draw a circle in Europe of core areas that attract migrants, if you would go back to the 1970s, it was a relatively small set of countries in Northwestern Europe. Talking about countries like Germany, obviously, Austria, Switzerland, France, the Benelux countries, not even the United Kingdom at the time, and Denmark and the south of Sweden. These were really the areas that attracted migrants. Now that circle has really expanded, particularly southward, but also westward. So it started to include the United Kingdom, Ireland, Southern Europe. And what we basically see is that line between net emigration, net immigration countries, which Ronald Skeldon has called the labor frontier, is expanding into Turkey right now. I think it is safe to say that the west of Turkey has been included in that group of countries. We see also increasing migration to North African countries, again, depending on political development, depending on demographic transitions. There is a possibility that those countries will also start to attract more and more migrant labor. Now, the real question is, where will those migrants come from? While shifting to Asia, I think it is also quite clear that Japan and South Korea are already beyond the point of denial in which they were perhaps 10 or 20 years ago, that they are effectively, if you look at the numbers, becoming immigration countries more and more so, again, mainly because of lower skilled labor shortages. This is not going to stop. But what to think about China, for instance? Assuming political stability in China in the future, it's almost inevitable that China will start to attract more and more migrants. The question is, where will these migrants come from? Mexico is not a good example. A country that starts to attract more and more migrants. In the case of Mexico, it's pretty evident. It is going to be Central and other Latin American countries that predominantly will, if you look at the geography of Mexico, that's pretty evident. But if you look at the greater European migration area, if you look at East Asia, where will those migrants come from in the future? The same for the Gulf region. We can already see some trends that seem to suggest, and this would totally fit within the transition models, the aspiration capabilities model, that any kind of development in sub-Saharan Africa and some South Asian countries will increase their immigration potential. And I think it is very likely that migration from those areas will increase, whereas migration from the current main source countries like Turkey, like Mexico, is already decreasing and will probably further decrease in the future as those countries will transform into destination of migrants themselves. So I don't think we're prepared for that at all. I think it is very naive to think that migration can fix these issues. I think it is in a way the same conclusion as for origin countries. The idea that immigration can fix the aging problem, I have a whole chapter in my book about this, that's a complete illusion. Aging is a structural trend that is affecting more and more countries in the world. If you really want to compensate for aging, you need migrant volumes that are probably 5 to 10 times bigger than they're right now. This is neither practically nor politically feasible. So I think that is a complete illusion. But we should also not buy in the other illusion that labor shortages will stop, will no longer be there in the future, particularly on the bottom end of the labor market. And I think that is a real debate we're actually not having. I see a lot of denial in the political sphere. Still many politicians arguing we only need higher skilled workers. I, by the way, object against the word need. I think we need to talk about the labor demand. I don't believe government should always give in the moment employers need certain workers. But if governments basically adopt a laissez-faire attitude as part of neoliberalism, then of course migrants are still going to come because we massively tolerate their labor. When just going back to the United States, we now get these images, and this is very much about projecting an image of toughness. It's really not about migration control. I mean, in the first Trump administration, the number of employers that got criminally prosecuted for exploiting migrant workers was incredibly low, between 15 and 20. So far, I haven't seen any sign that employers will actually be punished for abusing migrant workers. So I think we're still in a state of complete denial. And I think this political hypocrisy is going to hurt us. This is the elephant in the room. What are we going to do with lower skilled labor in the future? I think we really need a real debate about this. Migration cannot solve it, but migration will be part of it. And here also, I really think we need a nuance. Migration cannot fix problems, but we also have to think about how to make migration better work, also for lower skilled members of receiving societies. And here I think we need to stop just seeing migrants as a source of cheap labor, but to realize these are people. I mean, this is the famous citation from the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who said back in the 1960s about Italian workers in Switzerland that, yeah, we wanted workers, we got people instead. And I think we really have to think this through, because the longer we buy into illusions of temporariness, the more problems we will create in the future. Now that brings to me almost to the end of my talk. And this is the fourth topic I was asked to talk about, which is the rise of xenophobia in Western democracies and its impact on migrants' capabilities and aspirations. I think this is a real problem. I think what we right now see is that I already alluded to that. A lot of populist far-right politicians are sort of buying into this idea that migrants have caused many problems that people witness in Western societies, particularly people who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder. We talk about increasing inequality. We talk about lower job security. We talk about the lack of affordable social housing, problems in the healthcare sector. Of course, migration can increase or can contribute to pressures in those sectors. But of course, we also know from research that migration hasn't caused those problems. And again, that the causes of those feelings of discontent are rather to be found in neoliberal economic policies that have decreased protection for lower skilled workers, that have dismantled labor rights, that have eroded welfare rights, etc., that have privatized the public housing sector in many Western countries, which have decreased the stock of affordable housing. Of course, it's very attractive for politicians to blame immigrants. But I think we're in a very dangerous cycle where the policies that are being proposed actually don't solve any problem. And I think the real problem is the lack of governments to acknowledge the reality of migration. The reality of migration, which is one of migration will not go away. Migration is not good or bad. Migration is an intrinsic part of our societies. As soon as we start to deny the inevitability of migration in a certain extent, we also will continue the policies that don't solve problems, that rather seem to make them worse. And here I think we're in a real conundrum. And the debate is totally stuck. I mean, the United States has been in a deadlock for the last, since 1986, which was the last time under Ronald Reagan, there was a comprehensive immigration reform, which was a combination of legalizing 2 to 3 million, if I'm correct, undocumented migrants, plus a whole set of policies that propose to manage migration better in the future. Since then, no immigration reform has been possible. We also see that the debate in Europe is kind of stuck. There has been improvement when you talk about higher skilled migrant students, of course, freedom of mobility within the European Union. So we should also count our blessings. But I think the real conundrum is in how do we deal with asylum seekers and how do we deal with lower skilled migrants? Now, with asylum seekers, I think the only solution is to do things together. I think in Europe, we have seen a crisis of solidarity between European countries. And despite all the criticisms one may have on the sort of migration pact in Europe, at least I think it is one big step forward that European nations try to do something together. I'm quite skeptical in terms of the ability to seal off the external border because it is in a way the assumption underlying the pact. But we will see. I think it is very good that we try to forge a common policy, and I think that is the only way forward. But I also think it's a global responsibility. I think many countries don't contribute a fair share to receiving refugees. I do believe that Europe is taking in a much higher share of refugees if you look at the populations in quite some other areas in the world. So I think we also talk about the global responsibility. But numbers are not such that they're unsustainable. I've written a whole paper on this. Refugee numbers on the longer term are actually more stable than we often think. There are often short-term shocks. And in recent, of course, decade, we've seen those shocks, particularly in countries around Europe. And of course, it's triggered a debate. But I do think that there have been steps made forward, and I really hope these will be taken, because just closing the border, that is not a solution. That doesn't give any protection to people who flee, but collaborating within Europe, but also better global collaboration is the only way forward. I think, to be honest, the real conundrum is the continued demand for lower skilled labor, the policies of denial, and I think these can be politically incredibly harmful and even dangerous, in which a so-called fight against illegal migration will become an excuse to attack the democratic state we have, basic human rights. And I think this is the real danger. So I'm coming back to that issue, that we really need to address this elephant in the room and the political hypocrisy around migration. And this is more a political end of what I'm trying to say. I think we need a new generation of politicians who dares to step beyond the pro-anti frame, which has harmed us so much. Because how can we talk about migration in pro and anti terms? Because it would be like being against or in favor of the economy. It blocks any sensible debate about immigration. We see a situation in which the pro and anti-migration camp hugely exaggerate the benefits and the downsides of migration. We desperately need a more nuanced approach, and we need a new generation of leaders who is willing to acknowledge the reality of migration. Thank you very much for your attention.